Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephen Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, which is about when furlough stops and how we prevent a second wave of unemployment. This is jointly between the Learning and Work Institute and Reform. And I'm very pleased that Charlotte Pickles, the Director of Reform, will be speaking a little bit later. And also very pleased that we'll be hearing from Stephen Timms, MP, who is the chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee. We're going to be talking about what should happen when furlough ends, and indeed whether furlough should end or not, whether it should be extended, and how we can provide extra support to people to change jobs or to find new jobs if their old jobs are coming to an end. I'll say a little bit more about that shortly, and I'm also going to give a few of the edited highlights from the new labour market statistics that were released yesterday. Throughout this webinar, please do put any questions or comments or thoughts that you have into the chat box, and we'll try and bring in as many of those points as we can. Please, if you're on Twitter, do use the hashtag when furlough stops. And also we're going to have a couple of polls to vote on during the course of the event as well. We're going to do that via Slido. So you might have the app already, or you can go to slido.com, or as we bring it up each poll, you can take a photo of the QR code, which will take you directly through. And indeed, if you're I think most of you probably will be able to see the poll via the live streaming platform that we're using as well. So if we can, the first poll, which hopefully should be open now or is literally about to be opened, is about what should happen, or whether furlough should end, or whether it should be extended in some way, shape or form to particular sectors or particular areas affected by local lockdowns, or in other ways, shapes or form. So please do get voting away on that poll, and we'll see what results come up from that in due course. Probably have about 10 minutes or so, I think, to vote on that, so please do get voting away. Back to the labour market stats. So as I said, we had new statistics out yesterday, and I thought it'd be helpful just to go through a few of the edited highlights from those. In many ways, on a headline level, it all looked pretty plain sailing, really, and lots of good news in there, or some good news rather. But as I'll come on to in a second, below those headlines, I think some real problems and risks being stored up. But what you did see in the data is that as the economy started to reopen during July, you started to get more furloughed workers heading back to work, and an increase in the total number of hours being worked across the economy. And some of those who'd lost their jobs previously but had gone into economic inactivity because they either weren't looking for a job because of lockdown, or they weren't able to start a new job. Some of those people who were economically inactive, that number fell, and the numbers unemployed increased a bit. So you saw the signs of life in the economy being reopened a bit. It's quite difficult to tell exactly how many people are on furlough at any one time. We know that in total, about 10 million jobs have been furloughed over the lifetime of the scheme. And we know from official HMRC data that about 6.8 million jobs were furloughed at the end of June. And I think we'll get a further update possibly at the back end of this week. But if you look at the various surveys that have gone on, it's very clear that furlough number has dropped significantly during the summer, during July and August, not unexpected as the economy started to reopen. And in any case, the HMRC data potentially overestimates the total number of people who are on furlough, because it relies on administrative claims and it's for numbers of jobs, whereas some people might have more than one job too. So I guess on the basis of the data that came out yesterday, our guesstimate would be that there are about 3 million people still on furlough at the end of July. that comes from the fact that there were about 5.5 million people who said they were temporarily away from work for some reason. But there's always some, even before lockdown, there were about 2.5 million people away from work temporarily for some reason. That might be because they're ill, might be because they're on maternity or paternity leave, or a number of other reasons. So we've got that quote unquote normal level of 2.5 million, and then we've got, it's currently 5.5 million, or at the end of July it was. Take the difference between the two, that suggests about 3 million are furloughed. And that tallies with surveys by the ONS of businesses, which suggest that about 12% of the private sector workforce are still furloughed. So way down from the peak, and it's good that lots of those furloughed staff have gone back to work. But, and here's the but. So firstly, 3 million is still a lot of people. And as we get to October and the end of the furlough scheme, the question is what's going to happen to them? Why will they be able to come back to work? Will we be able to help them find other jobs? Second of all, although the headline employment and unemployment rates haven't shot up during the summer, there are lots of warning signs that suggest those headline figures aren't quite telling the whole story. So the claimant count, this is the number of people claiming unemployment related benefits, has more than doubled and is up around sort of 2.7 million level at the moment. Some of those are people who are in work, because you can have small amounts of earning, and still claim unemployment related benefits. But about 85% aren't. So you've got that big rise there. You've also had a drop of almost 700,000 in the number of people in payroll employment as reported by the HMRC. So again, it might be some errors in measurement there, but that's a pretty sharp drop. And then on top of that, in the latest set of data yesterday, there was a significant rise in the number of redundancies. To date, any deterioration in the labour market, any falls in employment, increases in those out of work, has come from, in general, from fewer people getting hired rather than lots of people losing their jobs. We're now starting to see maybe that putting an aspect of the economy over summer, protecting millions of jobs, that's brilliant. It was great that we got the coronavirus job retention scheme, but now we've had some people come back to work as the economy's reopened. But what about that increase in redundancies? Maybe we're starting to get those first signs in the official figures of unemployment starting to rise and come through. And we're heading into the time, I think we're about 90 days before the end of furlough, which is when the maximum consultation period that employers have to give for large scale redundancies. So it feels to me that although it's good that people have gone back to work from furlough during the summer, and that the headline figures haven't gone off the charts, but it's worrying that below that we've had this big rise in claimant unemployment and drop in HMRC employment. And I think we do worry about what's ahead over the course of the autumn. The one other thing I mentioned in terms of yesterday's stats was that I've talked in headlines and aggregates, but there are huge disparities across the country and across different groups. We know that young people and women were more likely to work in those lockdown sectors that were affected at the start of all of this. And the biggest rise in unemployment that we saw yesterday was amongst young people, so 18 to 24-year-olds. And we also saw falls in employment for those aged 60 and over as well. And then across the country, things have looked pretty different as well. There are lots of stories about city centres affected by people still working from home and therefore not coming in, and therefore reduced business for retail and hospitality, but also sort of coastal areas versus industrial areas, a story going on as well. And some areas that have had smaller rises in unemployment so far, but a risk perhaps that they've got wider use of the furlough scheme, and therefore the autumn perhaps looks a bit tougher. So it'd be good to get into the geography and the different groups that have been affected and how that links across to the Prime Minister's aim that he tells us around levelling up opportunity across the country. Last thing I'll say before I stop and move on to our first speaker is that I think it feels like we're in a sort of real age of uncertainty. So there are all kinds of predictions about what's going to happen next, and we've done a few of those as well. But the truth is that nobody really knows. So we don't quite know what's going to happen in terms of the virus. There's worrying signs about potential second waves, and that's going to have an impact on the measures, public health measures the government needs to take, whether that's national measures or local lockdowns. What effect will that have on jobs, and what support can we put in place for people affected by that? We don't know as and when, fingers crossed, better treatments and vaccines will come along. So how long are we going to be living with this virus in the current way? Do we just need to find a way to sort of live our lives whilst we've got that virus, or will we get a vaccine a bit sooner? We don't know what our trading relationship with the European Union will be from January the 1st. And so that creates huge uncertainties as well. And then if anyone can remember back to the dim and distant past of February, which feels like a lifetime ago now, we had a whole set of challenges and opportunities before this virus came along as well, whether it's automation, whether it's aging populations, longer working lives. All of that we felt meant that we needed more people to retrain and update their skills throughout their lives. And then the furlough scheme comes along and presses fast forward. The virus comes along and presses fast forward on some of that. But the furlough scheme's pressed pause, but we're about to unpress the pause button. So that's by way of context. I could say a lot about our proposed solutions to some of this and how we might respond. But I'm going to save some of my input for the discussion. And I'm going to move us across to our first speaker to talk about the report we did jointly with Reform. Before I do that, a quick reminder to keep voting away on the Slido poll and let us know what you think. I'm going to be closing that off after Charlie has spoken, so you've got about 10 minutes to vote on that poll and let us know what you think. And please do add in all your comments and questions and thoughts via the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Charlie Pickles, who's the Director of Reform. We were really pleased to collaborate with Reform on this report about what we do after furlough, and she's going to talk through some of the things that we found and some of the ideas that we were coming up with. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was brilliant doing a paper with Learning Work Institute, not least because of the richness of the expertise there. So it made our life very easy in coming up with the policies. Stephen's rather stolen my thunder in what I was going to say initially, which was to give that broader context. So all I will say is that the degree of uncertainty that businesses are facing today would imply that making investment in additional roles will be very minimal, and therefore whether it's the risk of further local, even regional, perhaps a national lockdown, whether it's the B word, which I certainly won't be going into today, but also other things like it's very likely we will see an increase in fear among the population as the government increases the restrictions around social distancing, etc. And therefore some of the gains that we've made in terms of the increase in demand we've seen over the last couple of months may well start decreasing again, which will add additional pressure again to businesses and therefore the labour market. So I think that context, as Stephen laid out, is really, really important when thinking about what the government should be doing and the scale and urgency with which they should be acting now. I did just want to pull out a couple of the things which Stephen touched on, but I think are particularly important to think about from the stats yesterday. One is, of course, the figure that we should all have at the front of our minds, which is that up to 3 million people are still on furlough, and the spike in redundancies that we saw in the last quarter. And the Institute for Employment Studies thinks that we may well see almost a threefold increase in that spike by the end of the year. So you have those still on furlough, but actually also just those in at-risk sectors. You think of the number of people who aren't going back to offices, roles that would typically be dependent on having those physical spaces. We're going to see redundancies on a much broader basis than just the furlough workers not returning. The fact that we're not seeing the hours recovery in line with some of that more encouraging data around employment, I think is a really important point, because not only are we going to have potentially a jobs bloodbath come the winter, and all those people unemployed are going to be looking for work, but actually all of those people who are underemployed, i.e. don't have enough hours, are also going to be seeking work. So the unemployment rate is probably going to be masking the demand and the pressure on the labour market over the next few months. The thing that we particularly focused in on in the joint report that we at Reform did with Learning and Work Institute was this quite profound sectoral impact of the current crisis. And Stephen noted that part of that has been speeding up trends, of course, that we've all been very aware of are happening, whether that's about, you know, the high streets, automation, etc. But actually, we've seen such a degree of speeding up that the policies in place are not sufficient to be able to respond to the sectoral shifts that we're seeing. And it's interesting, the OECD, when they did one of their reports looking at the impact of coronavirus on labour markets across the world, they made the point that governments are not just going to be dealing with a significant upsurge in job seekers, but actually they're going to have to be reallocating people across sectors and regions as a result of this particular crisis. And one of the challenges compared to previous recessions is that the jobs that typically after recessions are the ones that kind of create the sort of jobs recovery are the very ones that at the moment are most at risk and we are seeing greatest pressure on. So for all of those reasons, we do need to see the government do much more. And I think whilst we would all acknowledge just how impressive the speed at which the Treasury and HMRC stood up the programmes, both the furlough scheme and the self-employed equivalent. We all acknowledge how impressive that was, and it certainly has, and we've seen that very much so in the data, protected a lot of people during the period. I would have to say I think their response in thinking about the next phase has been really disappointing and far too slow. So one of the points that we made in our report was that you already have, in terms of those people who are on furlough, a sort of ready-made pool, if you like, people you know where they are and you could have direct access to via the businesses that are making claims via the furlough scheme to put in place skills development, support, preventative type interventions that would place those workers who may well, probably will, a large proportion of them end up not going back to work, but in fact, through redundancy unemployment, they would be in a much better position to then look for work in other sectors had they been able to access support during the furlough period. Of course, there are things which are welcome, the Kickstarter programme, doubling of work coaches, more money for careers service. But again, it's not enough and it's not happening quickly enough. And I think that's a real message that we need to get across to government, which is that time is of the essence here. If you just think about those people who are still on furlough at the moment, there will be a significant number of them, if they do indeed end up in unemployment, who are actually making a significant dent into being long-term unemployed. If you think about the fact they won't have worked potentially since early March, and long-term employment typically would be 12 months, we're already potentially by the end of the furlough scheme getting on for 8-9 months that this group of people have not actually been in employment. So I think we really need to think about the scarring impact and the potential distance from the labour market that some of those people are going to be. So in our paper, and I encourage everybody to go and read it. It's pretty short, it's terribly well written, very informative, lots of great ideas. I'm sure someone will be tweeting the link to it as I speak. But we essentially categorise sort of two sets, if you like, of policy recommendations. So one was an offer, a universal support offer to all of those people who are on furlough or in an at-risk sector, because as I say, there's a much broader challenge here than just those people who are on furlough. And we have recommended that government puts in place additional support to enable those people to access online or one-to-one advice and guidance and career support, but also a entitlement to be able to access skills training. But the other group, and I think this is the group that's been tremendously and worryingly overlooked in the government's response, are those who are going to have to shift careers. They're going to have to start over again in an entirely new sector because there are not going to be jobs in the sector that they may well have spent, decades working in. And that's going to be a massive challenge. And we think there could be up to 200,000 people in that category, so not an insignificant number. And for them, we are recommending much more generous, ambitious and targeted support that we think should include a £5,000 individual learning account to enable them to do the retraining to start again in a new sector. They may well, because they're starting again, have to take a wage drop, and therefore we've also recommended some form of time-limited, means-tested maintenance grant of up to potentially £3,000 to help mitigate the wage drop. We also want businesses to be able to use the apprentice levy towards wage subsidies, and we think there should be an equivalent grant from government for SMEs to do the same. And finally, we think that the government should be working closely with businesses to set up sector-based ambition programs like the US Work Advance programs, which would be about training and skills development where the demand is in local labour markets. And then those businesses that are taking part should guarantee an interview to career changers who have completed those schemes. And we think that package taken together, which needs to be rapidly implemented, could make a real difference in enabling people to actually pick up, move sectors, get into jobs when they are available, because we need to be doing that work right now, not waiting until the real crisis hits.
Great, thank you, Charlie. And just before I move us on to our next speaker, I'm going to take chair's privilege just to ask you one quick question, which has come through from somebody who's anonymous, therefore I can't give you their name. But asking and asking about whether the I can't remember the exact name of the policy now, but the £1,000 bonus to employers for keeping furloughed staff on continuously to the end of January, is that going to make much of a difference, or are we just kicking the can down the road, or what's your kind of view on that?
I mean, so our view at Reform is that it won't make much difference, but that it will end up having a very huge price tag, which you could have spent that money much more effectively in putting in place the sort of support policies that we have jointly recommended. And I think looking at what others have said, that seems to be a fairly consistent view that it's not going to move the needle, but it's going to be very, very costly.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give everybody just a few more minutes to vote on the Slido poll, which should be on your screens. Well, there you go. There's so far we've got yes, the furlough schemes should be extended for certain sectors like hospitality, about 59% of people. For local lockdown areas, 18%. For time limited period, 13%, and no, 10%. So that's a fairly clear result so far. So if you, whether you agree or disagree with that, I'm going to give you a few more minutes just to kind of try and get your preferred option to the top of the queue. I'm going to ask now our next speaker, who's Stephen Timms, the chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee. And I know you've worked in this area around work and employment and social security for a long time. So we're very interested to hear your thoughts on this and some of the priorities that we should be looking at ahead.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me. Well, there is clearly now the possibility that we're going to run into the worst employment crisis since the 1930s over the next few months. The Bank of England predicted in August that unemployment is going to reach 7.5% by the end of this year. That would mean 2.5 million out of work. Others are warning of 3 million or 4 or more. And one of the points I noted in your report today is that claimant unemployment has risen most in areas where unemployment was already high. So the Chancellor clearly is going to have to address this very big economic challenge in the budget that is coming up. I think he needs to help businesses recover. He needs to stimulate new investment to create new jobs to replace those which have been lost and aren't coming back. He sketched out some ideas along these lines already, but I think he is going to need to go further. Your report suggests a bigger programme of investment in home energy efficiency than the one that's been announced so far, for example, and I think we are going to need more initiatives along those lines. But he's also going to need to support existing jobs which do have a future, but are going to take some time to get back to normal. And it does seem to me that simply shutting down the job retention scheme at the end of next month isn't a credible policy in these circumstances. My colleagues in the Treasury Select Committee, chaired by Mel Stride, who was Financial Secretary when Philip Hammond was Chancellor, they recently commended a targeted extension to the job retention scheme to support sectors and individuals who still need it. And it may well be that sectors with the highest proportion of furloughed jobs are going to be the sectors that need it most and where you can most readily justify continuing support. So hotels, hospitality, entertainment, recreation, gyms, construction. I wonder about aviation. All of those, I think, ought to be in the frame. And we've been reminded already about the situation of young people, but 16 to 24-year-olds are also much more likely to have been furloughed than older workers. And there is this very serious danger, I think, of very high levels of youth unemployment ahead. And we mustn't forget there is a large group of workers who've been unable to work, but also been ineligible for the job retention scheme or the self-employed scheme either. We recommended on the Work and Pensions Select Committee that the government ought to bring forward the proposed employment bill as soon as possible to increase legal protection to people in low-paid work and in the gig economy. We welcomed in our report in June the fact that people with no recourse to public funds have been able to benefit from these schemes, but once they end, the case for the no recourse to public funds restriction to at least be suspended for the duration of this pandemic, it seems to me even more compelling than it already is. And of course, and Stephen, you've made this point, our attempts to recover from the pandemic are going to unfold in parallel with whatever trading relationship we end up with the European Union. And if we do end up without a deal, we could suffer further massive damage, not least to manufacturing jobs. So in June, in our first report as a newly constituted select committee, we scrutinised the department's response to the pandemic. I've been a strident critic of various aspects of universal credit, but I acknowledge, as our report does, that the universal credit system and DWP staff have done a pretty good job of providing financial support to a very large number of people quickly and efficiently. I think that's part of the successful early response that Charlotte referred to. In our report in June as well, we pointed out that the Future Jobs Fund, which was established in 2009, was very successful in limiting youth unemployment in that recession. It was, I think, a pretty cost-effective initiative as well. It was closed down by the coalition in, well, they announced its closure in 2010. It actually closed down in 2011. But I think that did a great job. And I was very pleased, therefore, when in July the government announced the Kickstart scheme, which is pretty much identical. Partly, I think, to try and differentiate it from what was a Labour initiative, ministers are emphasising the use of Kickstart by private employers, and that will be a good thing. But the demand that employers produce at least 30 Kickstart placements, which kind of puts it beyond the reach of small firms, is particularly unhelpful. I hope that's going to be addressed. We've seen some suggestions that it may be. But there is another difficulty here, which ministers, I think, do need to be aware of. As we've been reminded by Charlotte, a lot of private employers are going to be laying people off in the next few months. They're not going to be creating new roles. That is going to constrain their capacity to use the scheme. They certainly can't use government, the government couldn't allow them to use government money to replace former staff with new ones. So I think it is very important that, as with the Future Jobs Fund, charities and local authorities are encouraged to make full use of the Kickstarter scheme, and the Secretary of State to be fair, Heather Shoreby, that is ministers' intention, but they're not, I think, at the moment in what they say about the scheme, making as much of that as they should. The plan for jobs published in July also said that for people out of work for longer periods, the government will launch, and I quote, a new large-scale employment support offer with details due to be announced shortly. And then the Secretary of State told the committee in July that she's going to be expanding the existing work and health programme, that, I quote, escalation will be underway certainly in the autumn. And she also said that the department is, and I quote, setting up some schemes in the next financial year. And I just make the point that ministers really do need to get a move on here. It takes months, as we've seen repeatedly in the past, for these schemes to get into their stride once they've been launched. The work and health programme has been spending a couple of £100 million a year up till now. The work programme in the last recession was spending a couple of £1 billion a year. We need an order of magnitude step up, and we really need to get a move on with delivering that. Kickstart is a recognition that youth unemployment is going to be a big challenge in the next few months, but it's not going to be enough on its own. The Prime Minister spoke earlier in the summer of an opportunity guarantee for young people. We don't really know what that's going to consist of, and I rather get the impression that that phrase may be something we don't hear too much about in the next couple of months. I think we should hear more about it. I applaud the work that the Youth Employment Group has been doing in drawing up recommendations for what's needed. They've been arguing for a guarantee of a high quality education or training place or an apprenticeship for every young person, targeted deployment of the European Social Fund and of its successor from next April, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. They've called for promotion of employer transparency over who is at risk of redundancy, so where help's needed, and also continuing the current suspension of the minimum income floor in universal credit to avoid discouraging self-employment for young people. I think the Youth Employment Group is also right to argue for specific support for young people facing specific barriers. The plan for jobs doesn't mention disabled people or people with health problems, and we know they are more vulnerable to losing their jobs. And Age UK, the Multiple Sclerosis Society, TUC, are in a coalition calling for a new scheme to support the clinically vulnerable and those unable to return to work safely, of whom there are going to be a fair number for quite a while yet. So I think whatever happens, there are going to be further heavy demands on the social security system. Is the Department for Work and Pensions ready for a further big surge in claims? The department has announced it's going to recruit 13,500 new work coaches, with 4,500 expected by the end of next month. I'm wondering if we're going to see recently closed job centres like the one in my constituency having to be reopened. That one is still an empty building. But it does seem that very few of these new recruits are in post yet. The £20 a week uplift to universal credit is due to end next April. The Treasury Select Committee has recommended that the government ought to consider keeping it, and there are growing calls for that. The government rejected my committee's calls to extend that uplift to people in identical circumstances who are claiming the older benefits, job seekers allowance and so on. But the government rejected that, but those calls are not going to go away either. So I think there is a great deal at stake in decisions that are going to have to be announced in the budget and over the next few months. And I really welcome the contribution of this report and the fact we're having this discussion now to try and thrash out the ideas that we're going to need for the steps that have to be taken ahead. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stephen. There's lots in there for us to talk about. I'm going to maybe ask you first in a second about some of the points you made about speed of response. Just before I do, if we can try and just in terms of the Slido poll, just confirm the results of that first poll, which yes, so basically from our non-representative sample, I'm going to admit freely, strong support for extending that furlough scheme in some way, shape or form, and we can get onto that in a bit, for certain sectors, and certainly very few people saying we shouldn't have any form of support whatsoever beyond October. So thank you to everybody for voting in that, and we'll kind of come on to that in a second. But before we do, if we can open up the second poll, which is going to ask about, you know, given that we need to do, you know, more stuff, particularly to help at least some people who are not going to be able to return to their previous jobs or to retrain for new careers as the economy changes, what do we need to do about it? So the good news is here is you can select more than one option, but you can see some of the options that we've put up there. There will definitely be more things. There's only so many options you can put on a poll. So if there are other things you think should be on there, please do flag them up via the chat as well, and we'll try and get on to some of those as we go through. So while everyone's voting away on that, let me come back to you, Stephen, about the point about speed of response. And I think you were right to say a huge well done to the DWP frontline staff who worked so hard to process a 7-fold increase in universal credit claims. And actually the coronavirus job retention scheme, you know, inventing that from scratch and getting that up and running to cover up to 10 million jobs was a great job by the Treasury and the HMRC. I guess, and it's always easier for people like me who are not sat in government to say we'd like stuff done more quickly, but I'm just kind of, I would share some concerns about the fact that the first Kickstarter placements, for example, Kickstarter's great. We argued for something building on the Future Jobs Fund, but the first placements aren't going to start till November. And so are we already going to lose some young people who are flowing into the labour market after education, after the summer, and those who lost their jobs at the start of lockdown? And similarly, on long-term support for the long-term unemployed, even if we start, let's say the DWP decide we need a new programme, even if they started commissioning that tomorrow, given I used to commission these things, April or May would be quite ambitious to get the thing started, and they're not going to start commissioning it tomorrow. So I guess I'm interested in reflections about which areas you'd like them to sort of really focus on pushing faster, and any sort of sense, is there a concern that because the headline figures don't look so bad that therefore we can take a bit of time, or is it just the normal government processes?
Well, I mean, Kickstarter, I think, is probably just in the nick of time. It would have been great to have had it a few weeks earlier, but November is, I think that's in time to do much of the job that's needed. My impression is that the department has been aware for quite a long time that they need to do something pretty big and pretty quick, and so I'm a bit puzzled about why we really haven't heard more about what it's going to be. The Secretary of State told us, as I mentioned, that they're planning an expansion, I presume a big expansion, of the work and health programme, which hasn't really been much to write home about so far, but we've heard nothing more about what that's going to comprise or when that's going to take effect. And then there is talk about, and she suggested to us there'd be other schemes that we wouldn't hear about probably until the new year. So I suppose we are waiting for the detail about the expansion of the work and health programme, if that seems to be the form that they are planning to move forward with. And I have no idea when we're going to hear about it. I hope it's going to be kind of days rather than weeks before we hear about it. And I agree with you that once it's been announced, once we've been told what all this is, it will still be several months before it's actually in effect. And that is starting to feel a bit late, and I don't know why that's happened when I know that people in the department have been working hard on these ideas for quite a period of time now.
Yes, and Charlie, if I can bring you in on this topic, because it feels to me like the response in the Department for Education for adults and those furloughed workers, but everyone who needs support to retrain or to get into learning, and the DfE covers England, so we're talking about England here, feels slower and less fulsome than some of the DWP responses that we've just been talking about. So is it a kind of, this is a slightly leading question, but is it a missed opportunity, and why is that, and what should we focus on next to sort of get on with it?
Wow, Stephen, it's funny you should mention that. Yes, I think it's a huge missed opportunity, and I think not just actually in the context of what's going on at the moment, which is clearly incredibly important, but also in the fact that we've had successive governments say how important skills are, and we have known, as we've all said, that the labour market is going to be shifting for quite some time, and that we were going to need to have right to retrain. We were going to need to be investing much more in enabling people to change sectors as the labour market was shifting, and we've done very little about it. And we're now in a crisis where the impact is going to be so profound that we're going to be potentially having up to, as we said, 200,000 people needing to literally change careers, i.e. they're not going to be able to get back into the sort of job they were doing. And yet we seem to have silence when it comes to anyone over the age of 25 in terms of accessing that skills support. So I think, I think Stephen is absolutely right in being slightly puzzled, I think the word was that you used, as to why DWP has not been faster in standing up programmes that, quite frankly, most of the sector have been screaming about for months now. But I think DFE is just as much ignoring the scale of the challenge that they're going to be facing for the working population. And I would just say, it's right that we focus on young people, because clearly when you look at them as a proportion of their own age group, they've been particularly hard hit. But if you actually look at the claimant caseload, i.e. Who actually makes up those people on unemployment benefits, it's something like around 80% are actually above the age of 25. So we do need to be, I think, a little bit careful in only focusing our efforts, and it does feel a bit like we are only focusing our efforts on young people. It needs to be both.
Just to follow on, I was bound to be the first person to forget to unmute, wasn't I? We'll edit this out afterwards. Just to follow on briefly on that. So we did a report with the Centre for Ageing Better a few weeks ago about over 50s who have had a smaller spike in unemployment, but generally our experience says that they struggle more to get back into work than the younger age groups, and employment programmes have worked less well for them in the past. So I just kind of wonder if there's any sort of reflections or thoughts or focus about those over 50s and in both the employment and the skills systems as well.
Well, I think that's the job that we're going to have to look to the Work and Health Programme, it seems it's going to be called, to help with. I agree with Charlie's points about the need for better skills provision. I think further education has got a really important part to play over the next few months, and I'm not sure whether they've got the wherewithal fully to contribute at the moment. Maybe we're going to see some further announcements there. But I think it's absolutely right to be concerned about older people as well. But we did have, although unemployment was pretty low before the pandemic, youth unemployment wasn't that low. There was already a bit of an issue there. There was still, there's 1 million NEETs, I think, people not in employment, education or training before the pandemic, and now there's been a further big hit from the pandemic. So I think it's right to be concerned about that group too.
Yes, I just to add to our list of concern, because we haven't got enough. I'd mentioned 16 and 17-year-olds as well, most of whom are not eligible for benefits and therefore getting support through Job Centre Plus, and most of them are in education. But of those who aren't, the employment rates are pretty low, and again, NEET rates are relatively low for that group. But of those who are NEETs, we don't even know where half of them are. Their status is recorded as unknown. So. Charlie, do you think there's a kind of what about those? Sorry, I know we're supposed to be talking about those furloughed workers and retraining, but actually those 16 to 17-year-olds have been pretty hard hit, low numbers but high impact in the furlough figures and the employment data. Do we need to extend eligibility to UC, the universal credit, to those groups, or do work harder to get them back into education? Or
an interesting question whether you want to extend UC. I mean, clearly, if you have a 16 or 17-year-old who is not in education, not in work or training, there are probably other significant issues in their life. Some of these people may be care leavers, some of them may be homeless. You know, there are probably a whole other set of factors. And I think that just thinking about whether the benefit system needs to respond to them is not enough. Now, clearly, yes, there probably is an argument for saying that some support should be provided. Already we have a system that pays lower levels anyway for some young people versus older people. And I think there's a very legitimate argument to say that that's not right either. And we probably need to pay higher benefits to younger people, full stop. So I think there is that, but I think there's also a strong argument to say we need to be much better at wraparound care, whether that's, you know, social services, DfE, kind of housing, benefit system, the whole lot, if you're talking about 16 and 17-year-olds that are falling through the gaps.
Okay, I've led us marginally off topic there, but it's important and it's related. So I'm going to get us back on topic. Let's talk a little bit about what we do now. We've talked, and I think both of you have highlighted the risk of a second wave of unemployment and an employment crisis coming. So this gets us back to the first poll, which was around the extent to which we should say, well, a lot of current furlough jobs, so those 3 million-ish, will be viable in some way, shape or form, or it's just not realistic that other jobs are going to pop up somewhere at the current time, and therefore we need to protect them, whether that's, you know, the job support scheme we've called for to top up wages or something else, or the extent to which we say, look, people are not going to come back and work in city centres in the same numbers, and so all of the retail and hospitality around that, there's going to be less of it, but there'll be new opportunities around where people are working from home or other things, and we can't hold back that adjustment because it's giving false hope to people, and we need to let the economy adjust, and therefore the focus should be employment support and retraining. So I'm kind of interested in where we draw that balance, or how we choose to draw it, given the uncertainties we've got, which kind of leads us on to where you put your policy priorities between retraining and employment support versus some extension of the furlough scheme. So that's a pretty big question, but Stephen, should we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the truth is there are some jobs where things are getting back to normal. People are coming back to work and they're going to be fine. There's no need for sort of subsidies there. But there are other jobs that are never, ever going to come back. And we don't want to be subsidizing them either, because there's going to have to be changes there, the kind of retraining that Charlotte's been talking about. In between it, there is a whole load of jobs that are going to come back one day. Who knows quite how long it's going to take. We are still going to need to go to hotels. We are still going to use aeroplanes. And I guess it's identifying those is the key, because those are the ones it probably is right to provide some support to tide people over for a period. Maybe an element of wage support, perhaps less than the furlough scheme has been offering, even in its current guise, but something. Now, I completely take the point that working out which jobs are in that middle category is very difficult, but I think it's got to be done. I think simply saying, I agree with the poll. Simply saying we're going to scrap all this on the 31st of October isn't really credible.
And so, Charlie, it feels to me like we don't quite know exactly what's going to happen or which jobs are in those categories that Stephen mentioned, and therefore you need to accept that you're probably going to overdo policy in one direction or another, and you just accept is which risk do you want to accept. So where do you draw the line on that?
So this is one of those areas, and I think you're probably not supposed to say this, but where I've actually changed my mind. So I was quite strongly of the view probably a couple of months ago that we shouldn't be extending the furlough scheme because you were creating effectively zombie jobs. So jobs that weren't going to exist, and you were preventing people from shifting and doing that retraining. Not that there was any real support in place for them to have done that, but you needed that restructuring of the labour market to start happening. That I think was back in the heady days when we were coming out of lockdown, and it looked like we got the virus under control, and kind of things seemed quite positive or going in a positive direction. I think we're in very, very different territory now. And I think any good policymaker should be able to recognise when things have shifted and take different decisions accordingly. And therefore, I would agree with those who have taken the poll today in saying that there probably does need to be an extension. I would say at least into the new year, say end of January, something like that. To get us through the winter crisis that we're going to be having, crises on a number of fronts, jobs, health, etc., and probably, certainly restricted to certain sectors that are impacted. And I think the costs of not doing so are far higher and will outweigh the costs of keeping the scheme going, both in terms of the economy and in terms of individuals and the scarring that goes with both.
Thank you. And I've had, so via the Q&A, we've got a live update on policy implementation. To go back to one of Stephen's earlier points, I can happily say. So thanks to Anthony, who's said that the expansion of the Working Health programme starts on the 5th of October. So we're sort of a couple of weeks or so away from that, a few weeks away from that. And we're expecting, this is somebody else has said this, the sort of whatever the future follow-on programme looks like employment support wise to start commissioning October, November. I guess that probably depends on when the spending review is and what it says, and therefore if you're into November for starting commissioning, it feels like late summer next year is, if everything goes right, which as somebody who's run procurements, they definitely don't. So that's so there you go, a live update, and which is both good and bad, I think. Can I just pick up the point maybe with you first, Stephen, around you mentioned the temporary increases to universal credit that we had at the start of the crisis, which I think were great, and certainly I would think they need to be continued beyond the end of March. And I agree with your point about expanding to legacy benefits. It feels like before this crisis we were talking about people are going to have to switch jobs more often, we're having longer careers, and there's and therefore with a more flexible labour market, there's a risk that you dip in and out of work, and therefore a safety net, more than a very low safety net, felt important. And then you layer this crisis on top of it, which is more people out of work, whatever the scale ends up being. Some of those jobs are not coming back, as everyone has mentioned, and we have, before the 5-year freeze to working age benefits, we had pretty low benefits compared to other countries and historically here. So is there a kind of case, do you think, for having that sort of wider safety net? And one of the points that we made in the report, ourselves in Reform, was about whether you could give extra career retraining support to those who've paid into the system and put a contributory element to it. So I'm kind of interested in the sort of level of the safety net overall, but also is there a case for some more contributory elements around that retraining side?
Well, I certainly think there is a strong case for keeping the £20 in place, because as you say, we've had a benefits freeze. The level of benefit going into the crisis was terribly low, and I think a lot of people who've gone onto universal credit and benefited from the extra 20 quid have been surprised to discover what a small amount of money they've got out of it all. And the idea of reducing it by £20 a week for everybody from next April is, I think, a very hard sell. So we'll see. I'm interested by the idea of developing further the contributory idea and doing perhaps something around training. I'm not quite sure what that would look like, but I think it's definitely worth pursuing. I mean, of course, there are people who are arguing at the moment, and given the changes ahead with automation and AI and so on, that what we ought to be doing is looking at the prospect of a universal basic income. That is actually something that our committee is going to look at in the context of the inquiry we're starting next week on the future of work and whether changes in the labour market demand that approach. I must say, personally, I'm a bit sceptical about that, but there are people who are arguing for it, and I understand why they're doing it. But the idea of some more contributory features, I mean, the problem with that approach always is the cost. But if one can come up with a way of doing it that is affordable and makes the character of the system more contributory than the one we've ended up with now, then I think that would be a good thing.
Well, I feel a future webinar coming on about the future of work and basic income versus I certainly, well, it's a shame we're coming into the last 5 minutes here because I can see Charlie itching to speak about that. But I'll let you get a word in on that, but also the points about the contributing stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really, really important area, actually. And, you know, to use that classic phrase of never letting a kind of crisis go to waste, I think looking at whether the welfare system is sufficient in this country anymore, I think is a really, really important thing to do. If I was wearing a different hat, I sit on the Social Security Advisory Committee as well. And one of the things we have been very adamant about is that the discrepancy between the increase on UC versus the legacy benefits is appalling and should be addressed. But putting my reform hat back on, and we are going to be doing actually a big piece of work looking at the contributory principle and whether the welfare system should be more generous. I would just, I suppose, observe very briefly, one of the reasons why in this country we had to stand up a furlough scheme is precisely because we don't have the sort of benefit system that is tied to earnings and therefore more contributory that an awful lot of European countries have. So, you know, countries like France and Germany and Sweden, etc., were able to just flex their welfare systems because they were designed on a income replacement rate that was in relation to your earnings. And I do think we should be thinking about how you might do that and whether you do that on, say, something like a kind of, it's a bolt-on amount. For example, if you've paid in certain nicks into the system for a time limited period, I think we do have to come to a point where we make the system work better for a broader number of people who may have to rely on it. But okay. Not UBI, if I can just get that in.
There's the Twitter quote. Well, we definitely got the topic for the next webinar, I think. So you'll both get an invite to that. We're coming into the last couple of minutes. So what I might do is just, if we close off the poll and just give the results of that and then ask for any final reflections from both of you in terms of the discussion and then also the results of the poll. So this necessarily doesn't sum to 100 because you're allowed to select more than one option. So far and away, the two most popular were about training tailored to specific jobs and careers and help with the costs of retraining. We've hacked back the adult education budget in England by 50% in the last 10 years, which, given that the population has grown, is a sort of bigger cut per head, if you like. So it feels like some form of lifelong learning entitlement or refocusing some of that effort is very important. But some support for there for careers advice, apprenticeships. Again, we could have another webinar on that because increasingly apprenticeships have gone to older existing workers rather than young people starting their career or career changes. So we might do another webinar on that one. And then help with living costs, you know, still getting 23%, but lower down the list. I guess we asked the question about support for retraining rather than general overall priorities. So if I come to each of you in turn, Charlie, if I start with you, reflections on that, but also any final reflections on the topic in general.
I guess my reflection would be how sensible our audience are today, in that I have broadly agreed with both polls. So I think, yes, I think the priority has to be getting back to upskilling the population in a way that is going to be appropriate for the future labour market, and that is going to be what enables us to have a greater productivity, you know, a more dynamic economy, as well as helping those individuals. And I suppose my final reflection, or the thing that I would kind of most want to hammer home, is this needs to happen now. You know, there is the idea that we might not have a kind of proper program to help long-term unemployed happening until well into next year is a huge mistake. You know, we have to be acting now and investing in skills, training, learning, employment support. We need to be doing it on the level of the furlough scheme and take it that seriously.
Great, thank you. And Stephen?
Well, I very much agree with the urgency. I mean, one reflection is, and this always comes out from discussions of this kind, that we need to to have a much better integration between our social security system on the one hand and our skills training system on the other. And, you know, I was the employment minister for a while. David Lammy was the skills minister. We always were talking and we agreed about what needed to be done, but actually delivering that integration was elusive then, and it seems to be elusive still. And I think maybe one way you can bring them better together is if you do things at a more local level, a kind of city region kind of level, then maybe that's where we can bring about the kind of integration which discussions like this make clear we desperately going to need over the next few months.
Thank you. Yes, I remember talking about those conversations with that you had with David Lammy, and as somebody who's written various papers within government and outside government, is I'd like to make it not a job for life to argue for employment and skills to be joined up. But yeah, as the Learning and Work Institute, we've obviously got a vested interest in this. But I do think there's a general point there as well about you know, as part of, you know, making an announcement is the start of a process, and the risk is you sort of feel like you're pulling a lever and then nothing happens, or the opposite to what you think is going to happen happens, which the current government is finding, as previous governments have before them as well. So again, it feels like we've got a future webinar series coming up here, because we should definitely do something on that. I'm going to have to bring us to a close, but I wanted to say a big thank you to Reform, because we've really enjoyed working with Reform on this topic and on this report and today, and we hope we'll be able to continue working together. And a big thank you to Charlie and to Stephen for sparing the time today and speaking, and a huge thank you as well. No, pleasure, thank you. And a big thank you to all of the people who've been viewing and voted on the Slido poll and asked lots of questions on the Q&A as well. Trying to get as many topics in as possible, but inevitably you don't quite cover everything. But a big thank you to everyone for watching this, and it will be on available to view, hopefully with my mismuting edited out, I say to our comms team very shortly. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.